Okay, welcome everyone to the Section 508 Best Practices webinar. We're about to start. Welcome to the Section 508 Best Practices webinar. Today's session is accessible virtual webinar meeting platforms. At this time, I'd like to hand the microphone to Tim Cregan from the U.S. Access Board CIOC Council.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the Section 508 Best Practices webinar series for July 21st, 2020. This webinar is part of a series showcasing best practices in federal Section 508 implementation. Other presentations in this series may be viewed at the archives at www.adaconferences.org/CIOC archives. A best practice is a policy, process, procedure, or technique proven effective over time and repeatable by multiple agencies. A best practice is generalized so that diverse agencies may use it in their own organizations, but it's specific enough to provide useful guidance and instruction. The CIOC Council's Accessibility Community of Practice has published a library of Section 508 best practices, which may be accessed at www.section508.gov. I would also like to point out that the webinars in the archives are organized by subject area. So you may search on subject topics for the webinars, which go back 7 years. Next slide. The Section 508 Best Practice webinar series is held bi-monthly during the calendar year, starting in January and continuing every other month through November. The next webinar in this series will be held on Tuesday, September 9th, and the topic will be Managing for Accessibility Through the Acquisition Lifecycle. It will be held at the same time, 1 to 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. This webinar series is a collaborative program between the Accessibility Community of Practice of the CIO Council and the U.S. Access Board. Next slide. This webinar is brought to you by the CIO Council, and the logo for the CIO Council is a circle of blue stars surrounding the words CIO Council, and the website is cio.gov. Also co-sponsoring this webinar series is the U.S. Access Board, which is a red, white, and blue star surrounded by the words United States Access Board. Our website may be accessed at www.access-board.gov. Thank you. And with that, we will now start today's presentation. Next slide. We are on the title slide. On the title slide, today's presentation, our presenters are from the Department of Homeland Security and from the Federal Communications Commission. Today's webinar is on accessible virtual meetings. This is a topic that should be of great interest to all of us, as most of us are telecommuting into work, and we make great use of accessible meeting platforms. Today's speakers, who are Brandon Pace, who is the Enterprise Application Administrator at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Office of Accessible Systems and Technology. He and his colleague, Gerard Williams, who is the Section 504 Compliance Officer at the Consumer Affairs and Outreach Division of the Federal Communications Commission, will be talking about the various accessible platforms that are available for our use, and they will talk about various features of the platform. If you have questions, they will be responding to questions at the end of today's presentation. And with that, I would like to turn the presentation over to Brandon. Brandon?
Thank you, Tim. Next slide, please. So the communication rules I want to be able to talk about first before we introduce ourselves and start the meeting. I want to remind everybody to mute your microphones unless you're speaking, and leave your video on so that we have several presenters. Also identify yourself by your name before we start speaking, so as it'll be easier to identify who's speaking when. During the presentation, it's important for us to describe the images and read the text for users without visual access. And the presenters will have a pause between each slide for additional comments. So I also wanted to do a communication check and make sure that everybody can see us clearly and everybody can hear us clearly. Do we have a thumbs up on that?
This is Gerard Brandon. I see you just fine. I'm hearing your interpreters. I also want to check with the interpreters, make sure the interpreters have what they need on our end.
Yes, we're all good. Thank you. All right, so the next slide, please. Gerard, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. This is Gerard, and this is our introductory slide, just telling you a little bit about ourselves real quick before we dive into the content. I am Gerard Williams. As was said, I'm the Section 504 Compliance Officer with the Federal Communications Commission, also known as the FCC. I am also a nationally certified American Sign Language interpreter. At the FCC, I not only interpret, but I'm coordinating various accommodations for people with disabilities, whether they be visitors trying to access the Commission's programs and services, or for staff who are working with sign language interpreters and other accommodations. And I have collaborated putting together our Section 504 handbook, amongst other documentation at the Commission internally, to make sure we've got processes that are accessible for and provide inclusion to people with disabilities. Brandon?
Hello, and thank you, Gerard. My name is Brandon Pace, and I am the 508 Program Manager for the headquarters section at DHS, which is Department of Homeland Security. I'm also the president of the Deaf and Hard of Hearing DHS Employee Resource Group, and I am a certified professional in accessibility core competencies. Gerard, do you want to start with the disclaimer?
Sure, I'm happy to do that, Brandon. So there are a couple disclaimers we wanted to get out of the way before we jump into our content. The first is that between Brandon and I, we do not speak for all people with disabilities. So we're here to give you some tips and tricks and some guidelines to help steer you on the right path, but we cannot represent ourselves to be experts on disabilities, because the only expert on accommodations and inclusion for people with disabilities are those people with disabilities. So all of our advice today should be taken with a grain of salt, that we cannot give you kind of a bright line or a hard and fast rule about a lot of those things. A second important disclaimer, although we will be going through some specific software today and talking about specific platforms, neither DHS nor FCC nor either of us individually or as representatives of those agencies officially endorse or recommend any given product over another. We are going to be reviewing some of the products that happen to be within our experience, some of the ones that appear to be more commonly used. There are a whole host of different software that we will not be going into because we have a limited amount of time today. So please make sure to keep all of that in mind as we are going through. Brandon, did you want to add anything before we go to our next slide?
No, you said it. You said it all. Thank you. Next slide, please. So here's the agenda. Gerard, would you like to go over the agenda with folks?
Sure. I will read out the text we have on the slide, give everyone an opportunity to read it. And for those who cannot read it, you can listen to me speak it. We will be talking about accommodations versus accessibility. And that is not a battle to the death. That is a comparison of those two things and how they're different. We are also going to talk about challenges and opportunities presented by virtual meetings. We're going to go through some best practices, talk about some equipment and technology recommendations, and then we will do a virtual conferencing platforms overview going through the following systems: Zoom, Cisco WebEx, Google Meet, Adobe Connect, Microsoft Teams, and then we'll be speaking a little bit more generally to live streaming of any various platform that has its own particular quirks. And then right before our Q&A session, we will be talking about how do I pick a platform now that we have access to all of that information. And then finally, our Q&A session. Brandon, did you want to add anything?
No, that's great. Thank you. Next slide, please. So I want to share this quote. This quote is incredibly powerful. I'm going to go ahead and read it out loud. For most people, technology makes things easier. For people with disabilities, however, technology makes things possible. And that is a quote by Mary Pat Radenbaugh, who was the director of IBM's National Support Center with People with Disabilities, and that was from 1998. Next slide, please.
This is Gerard, and our next slide is titled Common In-Person Meeting Accommodations. And before I go through the text on this slide, I'll give you some context to this slide. Before we can really talk about making virtual meetings accessible, what we're really getting at is a translation of the things that we do in person that many of us have grown very accustomed to doing for in-person meetings, and how that translates and applies in a virtual space. So before we get to that virtual space, we wanted to do some level setting and review some of the common in-person meeting accommodations you may be familiar with, so that we can see if and how those things translate into a virtual space. I will re-emphasize our disclaimer here that this is not an exhaustive list. We do not purport to have every single possible accommodation listed here, but we wanted to give some examples and some of the more easily identifiable, visible accommodations that you might recognize. We have interpreters, and we have some interpreters working with us here today with Brandon. Those could be American Sign Language or ASL interpreters. Those could be tactile American Sign Language interpreters working with a person who's deafblind, or pro-tactile interpreters who are also working with people who are deafblind and use PT-ASL. We could have support service providers, sighted guides, or personal assistants. These would be other individuals who would be accompanying a person with a disability, whether they be blind, have a cognitive disability, or what have you, in order to provide support to them in real time in a meeting. We also have real-time captioning, often referred to as CART. This is different from closed captioning that we will see on television. It's very easy to confuse those terms, but usually when we're talking about real-time captioning or CART, we're talking about a live event and accommodations for people at that live event while they are there, as opposed to closed captioning, which generally means captioning that can be toggled on and off for someone who is watching something like on television, and as opposed to open captioning, in which captioning is always displayed for either a meeting or on a video stream. While we're on the topic of captioning, there is automatic speech recognition, sometimes called automated captioning or live captions. These are captions that are generated by artificial intelligence or computer systems that are using natural speech analytics in order to try to come up with the right terms. It's something that a lot of people are going to be familiar with today. We see a lot of that in products like Siri. The Amazon Echo uses this technology, although it doesn't always do a translation into text, but is doing speech recognition. And this is becoming more common. It is not one of the more common accommodations in person for meetings, but it is becoming more prevalent. So we wanted to mention it here, and we'll be talking more about that later. Assistive listening devices. These are devices in a room that are going to provide access to an enhanced audio experience for people who have hearing loss, whether they be hard of hearing or have audio processing disability. That often has a receiver that the person with disability either brings or borrows in room, and there's a transmitter that's going directly from the microphone to that receiver. Then we have documents in alternate formats. To the extent that you have documents in your meetings, you may have Braille or large print documents. You may have audio formats of those documents, whether they be text to speech or actual recordings. There's also electronic access to those documents so that people can use their own device. It can be sent over email, or a thumb drive or a CD can be provided to attendees so that they can use their own device, whether that has text to speech or a refreshable Braille display or what have you, whatever assistive technology they have in order to be able to access that. And then we have a couple other accommodations like note-taking for people who may have a graphology disorder, have difficulty writing. They may have a dexterity disorder. They're unable to take notes physically. There's also note-taking for people who are not able to split their attention between visually attending to an interpreter and taking notes. So there could be any number of reasons why someone would need note-taking. Extended breaks applies for many people with disabilities when some of these tasks that you might take for granted, like popping up and running out to the restroom, might take more time. People will often ask for a little bit more time, or more frequent breaks for people who are attending to interpretation, whether that be sign language interpretation or tactile interpretation or what have you. And then certainly special requests for seating locations, ensuring accessibility of seating and physical access there. Brandon, did you want to add anything before we move on?
I do. This is Brandon. I also wanted to mention that automatic captioning on speech recognition is a really new technology. So, let's not just assume that it's always going to work and be perfect and just go ahead and use it. It is making its way into the market, and it works most of the time fairly well, but it's not always perfect, and so that's something to recognize. So I will explain a little bit more about that in a next slide, and we will have a demo as well.
This is Gerard. Last thing I wanted to add before we moved off this screen is that Brandon and I wanted to be clear that this is not a menu which is pick one. This is but a sample of the various accommodations that are available.
Yes, it is.
They can be used in infinite combinations. So a person requesting interpreters does not preclude someone from requesting a support service provider or an assistive listening device or note taker. Any of these accommodations can always be requested in any combination. So we have to keep an open mind when we're thinking about accommodations so that we're not limiting ourselves to thinking one accommodation, one person. We're talking about ways to include people with disabilities.
Correct. And this is a perfect time to talk about an example. If a deaf person asks for both an ASL interpreter and CART at the same time, you can't just assume that the person it can do just with one accommodation or the other, and that one is enough. CART is used as an auxiliary aid, which means that it's in support of another service. And so you may think that the interpreter is enough, but if it is a big event, having both the interpreter and CART is often a successful way to provide accommodations. CART can also be used for somebody who has English as a second language. And so they are able to, learn new words via the CART. And it facilitates a different support system for the sign language interpreter. Is there anything else that you wanted to add, Gerard? Next slide, please. So this is Brandon. I wanted to go ahead and talk about this particular slide, and you can see the pictures up here. We have equality, accommodation, and accessibility. So this is, so if you have a screen and you've got two people standing there that can reach it and a third who is not able to reach it, there are different ways that you can make those things possible via accommodation or via accessibility. So the accommodation shows that there is a ramp that goes up for the person that is in the just a moment, this is the interpreter, who's a wheelchair user. There's a ramp that's provided for them, and then there is also a height aid that is provided for the person who is unable to reach. And then the accessibility, you can see that the whiteboard has just been lowered so that everybody is on par with the same level of accessibility for the whiteboard.
Good point.
So for, as Gerard had mentioned before, accessibility and accommodation are not the same thing. And as you can see here by the pictures that were shown, that is a helpful aid in understanding the difference between the two. So accommodations are for individuals and are not reactive. So if a person asks for help with an accommodation, you know, it could be services, or it could be tools, or it could be a number of things for an accommodation. And being proactive on that front, you know, helps with accessibility. So anyone who needs, you know, accessibility should be made available to all in an equally effective way and at the same time. Accessibility is a goal, and accommodations are the tool with which to reach them. Gerard, do you want to add anything?
Sure. I think you've said it really well. Accessibility is the goal and accommodations are tools to reach it. And the way that I sort of shorthand that is that accommodations are not accessibility. And as a person whose job it is largely to provide accommodations to people with disabilities, this has been an uphill battle for me inside my agency to explain to people that I can provide every accommodation in the world. Everything off of that list and 100 other things that are not on that list, I could provide for any given meeting or event. And that meeting or event could still be hosted in such a way that it's not truly made accessible. Not even to say inclusive, but not even accessible. The perfect and probably the simplest example of that is that we have two interpreters who are working with us right now. And if I had two people speaking at the same time over one another, you could provide 50 interpreters. You're still going to have a lack of access because one interpreter is only ever able to interpret for one person at the same time. And one deaf person is only ever able to attend to largely one interpreter at a time. So that is something that's entirely outside of my control as an accommodations professional. I can provide you with every one of these aids, but it really depends on the mindset of everybody in a communication event, in a meeting, to make that thing accessible. And accommodations, as Brandon said so well, are a tool to try to reach that. But in order to get to the goal, it requires a commitment to everybody who's participating.
Thank you. Next slide, please. Gerard, I believe this one's yours.
This is Gerard. So we're going to jump into virtual meetings now. I'm sure you didn't expect 15 minutes on not virtual meetings as part of your meeting about virtual meetings, but we're doing some level setting. First, we're going to go through some of the challenges of virtual meetings. We've got a list of bullets here and then an image I'm going to describe a little bit later on when we get there. The first one of these challenges is platform limitations and or technical limitations. So as we're going to go through today, and as everybody who's ever touched or seen a computer knows, those things are limited. We are limited by the software that we have access to. Any given individual is limited by the hardware that they have access to. I have access to multiple monitors on my computer system. That gives me a different advantage over other people who are trying to access the same content. We also have environmental limitations. Those can be things like security concerns, which differ from agency to agency, from entity to entity. Budgetary limitations for paid platforms versus free platforms. And each of those different limitations has a corresponding impact on what you have access to. So there's just a lot of uncertainty depending on what your context is. Somewhat related are licensing limitations. So even for a given product at an agency, there can be varying levels of access to that product. Some people have a more advanced license. People can be administrator users or have access to higher tier licenses or have access to webinar licenses when others have access only to a meeting or collaborative licenses. That adds further uncertainty to what it's going to look like for you. Speaking of uncertainty, we've got diverse access methods and diverse user interfaces. So with probably half a dozen of us right now on recording this, we probably have at least half a dozen different devices. People are probably connecting over PCs. They're probably connecting over Macs. They're probably using secondary devices to look at notes. They are likely either using an extra monitor or engaging in a split screen view, or perhaps not. There could be people who are using screen readers. There could be people using mobile devices. Again, lots of uncertainty in the user experience. This is very different from when we are all sitting in one room together and we all have a shared understanding of what is going on in this room. I can't tell you what Brandon's screen looks like. He can't tell me, he can't tell what my screen looks like. So that leads to our next point, which is a limited ability to provide technical support. So Brandon and I are both tech guys. It's one of the things that we get along really well with, dealing with technology and using all the tools at our disposal. And if I was trying to describe to Brandon how to do something inside our virtual meeting space, I do not have a fancy technical way that I can share with him the screen share tools to show him the screen share tools, because the screen share tools don't share themselves. I realize that is the world's most complicated sentence, but there are a lot of things about providing access on a virtual environment that can be very challenging. Explaining to people where they can click, where they're going to go in order to get access to certain options, because I don't have a way to live look at Brandon's screen and show him where it is. If Brandon shares me his screen, the system presumes he's sharing a PowerPoint or sharing a document. It doesn't presume that he needs help figuring out how to use the platform. That is a different type of screen share tool that exists, but largely in tech support areas. We don't have access to a lot of this fancy tech support stuff, so it can be very, very difficult to provide technical support and some of that training. Then getting to actually having a meeting, it can be awkward when you're over a virtual meeting. Hearing people have been encountering this for what feels like hundreds of years, although it can't have been that long because the phone's not been around that long. But a conference call is a terrible place to be. People who want to speak can't. You never know who's talking. You're trying to get a word in edgewise. You can't figure out how to do it. People start talking at the same time. And the worst thing is when somebody says, let's all go around and introduce ourselves. Well, how do we start? Who goes first? How do I even know how many people there are? How do we know when we're done? And someone just joined now that we've finished doing all of this. It can be incredibly awkward and artificial. Then we have conflicting accommodations. So we've got a limited resource. We've got a screen of a certain size. We've got limited bandwidth. We've got this many megabytes per second that are running through this pipe. So we've got to decide how we're going to use that. And as any limited resource, there's going to be conflict for that. So if we want to use screen space for captioning, we're taking away screen space potentially from American Sign Language interpreters. People who are hard of hearing may want to see the video of every single person speaking, whereas people who are deaf and relying on interpretation may ask that all videos be turned off except for their sign language interpreter, because they're not getting a lot of information out of looking at people speaking. So that can sometimes cause some tension. And the last thing that I have on this list is lack of experience in training. we were all thrown into the COVID-19 pandemic unexpectedly. It's just a fact. And we are all trying to play catch up. We thought that we were in the 21st century and that we were really getting our feet wet with engaging online and using these tools. And what we found was that we really weren't ready for a full virtual environment. And that unfortunately means that a lot of the software also wasn't ready, because you've heard all the stories that the software and the platforms were not equipped to be able to handle the influx of users. So we're all trying to get our feet wet. Before I go into the image, I want to give our interpreters a sec. I think they're going to switch off here. So I will describe now the image on the bottom of the screen here, and I'll do so quickly. It just goes to some of these challenges that we've talked about here. It is a 4-cell table, and on the left-hand side, the lower left says low, the upper left says high, and that indicates controls. So you can have low control or high control. And across horizontally, you've got low to high again from left to right, and this is demands. So you've now created this matrix where you have high control, low demand, low demand, low control, high control, high demand, and high demand, low control. I've emphasized 2 cells on this. That is both high demand and high control, in which I've put a green plus sign, sort of the universal sign for good. And in the high demand, low control box, I've put a red negative sign, which is sort of universal for bad. And I put this up here to say that we've been thrown into a virtual environment. We've got a lot of demands on us. We've got increased demands, if anything, certainly not decreased demands. But what we've lost is a lot of our control. We're very accustomed to the systems and the ways that we were able to operate in person. So we've lost control. This demand control matrix and demand control schema is often relied on in interpreting work. And so it's no surprise that I've brought it up here, but it is also about job satisfaction. So people who are in high demand but high control jobs generally find that they have good job satisfaction. But if you find yourself in a high demand, low control job, all of a sudden you have very low job satisfaction. It's very frustrating to have lots of demands put on you, but not have controls to be able to implement. Unfortunately, that's sort of where we are in virtual meetings right now. And I think why a lot of people do get frustrated is because we lack access to sufficient controls to compensate for the high demands that we've got. Brandon, did you want to add anything?
I do. So I wanted to ask, if there... So, sorry, do we want to talk a little bit more about this with regards to access for those who are blind?
Yes, thanks for that reminder, Brandon. One of the diverse access methods that Brandon's keeping me honest from my notes, something that I neglected to mention. And bullet 4, diverse access methods and user interface. We wanted to specifically call out people who are deafblind. So deafblindness is one of the most challenging disabilities to accommodate in a remote environment. You're talking about individuals who are, again, across the spectrum of vision loss and hearing loss, but there are significant portions of that population for whom moving to a fully virtual environment, having no tactile, that is touch access to anything that's going on, is incredibly, incredibly difficult. Beyond that, we have an uneven playing field here because you have a lot of people without access to sufficient broadband, without access to sufficient technology or to up-to-date technology, not to mention things like income inequality, where people with disabilities are historically under and unemployed at higher rates. So if you're finding a population that's not going to get access to the newest, coolest tech and have the world's best broadband, unfortunately, oftentimes you might be talking about people with disabilities. So we want to make sure that we're considerate of the potential impact of switching to these virtual environments and find ways that we can accommodate people in a diverse spectrum.
Thank you, Gerard. I appreciate that. That was beautiful. If we could have the next slide, please. And I believe, Gerard, you're going to continue with this particular slide.
Yes, this is Gerard, and everyone can rest assured this slide is our opportunity slide. So welcome, and Tim's getting us set up there. I think back one more. Thank you, Tim. That's perfect. This is our opportunity slide. Do not worry. It is not at all as long as our challenges slide. Oh, unfortunately, the opportunity slide is not as long as the challenges slide. So one of our opportunities is interface customization. So we talked about it as a challenge. You've got diverse ways that people are accessing the platform. However, one of the ways that you can ensure that you're able to accommodate people with disabilities is by letting them lead, by letting them choose their own adventure and pick the things that are going to work for them. So the ability for a given individual to completely customize their system that they are using to access a meeting so that the accommodations they already may have, their assistive technology is going to work for them, that their setup of the meeting is going to work for them, is going to give a lot more flexibility to those people with disabilities. So increased customization is a huge opportunity for virtual meetings. That goes right into user control of assistive technology. So people with disabilities are going to know what works for them. People are going to have access to the things that work for them. And if they can find ways to plug those into the virtual meetings that you're hosting, you better believe they're going to do it. Another opportunity, we've got potentially an expanded pool of people who are going to be able to participate in virtual meetings as opposed to having to come to an in-person meeting. You've got people that can be from diverse geographies. You don't have to be limited to your local area or limited to people who can afford to fly to your local area. You can potentially include people from all across the country, all across the globe. You can include people with disabilities who wouldn't otherwise be able to travel or to attend because they don't have access to transportation, or don't have the time to be able to dedicate to getting themselves to a location, participating in a meeting, getting back. You've now reduced the amount of time that people are going to need to be able to commit to it. You potentially have the option to increase productivity, and I think Brandon wants to talk about that a little bit.
Yes, this is Brandon. So with productivity, when we work from home, I've noticed, especially for myself, that I am really focused on my work because of less distractions. So I know that other people may have a different experience with that if you have families and children and whatnot. But for me, what I've noticed is the productivity really increases. And honestly, I feel personally, I normally work, 40 hours at the office, but at home, I feel like I'm putting in almost double that because I'm able to increase my productivity tenfold. So that's just another opportunity that we have as far as, these kind of working opportunities and these kind of working venues. Gerard?
This is Gerard. Yeah, I'll chime in one more point on that is that if you can let people work in places that they're comfortable, you're going to find that they're able to work more. So to the extent that you've got people with disabilities who are engaging from their homes, where presumably they're going to have access to things that make them comfortable and feel included, you could potentially increase satisfaction here. And then, as Brandon said, you're going to see some more productivity. Another one of our opportunities is to have richer remote interactions as opposed to the dreaded conference call of yesteryear that I mentioned, where we all are going to get on the phone and sort of slog our way through talking at each other. And then everyone knows that you've got to get your work done outside the conference call, because during a conference call, the only thing you get done is talking. But with the potential to live collaborate, to engage with some of these online tools, you've potentially increased, as Brandon said, productivity, and you've made these interactions much richer. Being able to interact with Brandon over video is much, much more engaging for me than it would be if we were connected over audio, right? As much as I thank his interpreter for being here to interpret him into English, being able to see him respond in real time to the things that I'm saying, for me to be able to notice when he wants to chime in, is a huge boon for us.
Exactly.
And the last bullet that we have is 3 periods and a question mark, because you'll note that this slide was significantly shorter than our challenges. But in some ways, it is an opportunity for us because we are so new to this fully virtual environment that we are still in the process of finding out what those opportunities are. Where are those places where we are going to see ourselves make more progress? And we may not be able to anticipate them now, but I can guarantee they're coming down the line. Brandon, did you want to add anything?
Do not. No, you've said it all. Next slide, please. So this is Brandon, and I want to talk about universal meeting design. I'm going to go ahead and read out these bullet points, and then we'll go through them one at a time. So the first bullet is establishing a single point of contact. The second one is asking for help. The third one is do a technology test in advance. The fourth one is broadcasting the communication rules, and the fifth one is embracing good meeting management techniques. So we're going to go back to the first bullet point and having a single point of contact. This is to help everybody who is requesting accommodations or any of the questions or logistics that come up to be filtered into one person. This decreases the headache of logistics and has a central point of knowledge with one person who's dedicated to basically sorting things out and to setting things up versus having a whole bunch of different people doing a whole bunch of different things, and the left and the right hand don't know what it is that is going on. So you have one point of person who all of the information is getting filtered through. So the second point is asking for help. This is for technical support when and if it is needed. If the meeting is not running the way that it should be technology-wise, then you can go ahead and ask for help to solve those things. Having a technology test in advance, the third bullet point, I cannot emphasize this enough. At DHS, we do this with all meetings, and it helps with providing opportunities to learn different pieces of technology, or when you run into problems, or if things are not calibrated correctly, we get to work all that out in the front end, and not as we are trying to do a presentation or the day of a presentation and, having 30 minutes of a meeting wasted trying to figure out where, how, and when we can fix this stuff, and then having 30 minutes taken off of our scheduled meeting and having 30 minutes left of said meeting. So that ends up preventing all of that, having the dry run ahead of time. So broadcasting the communication rules ahead of time or in the beginning, like we did with this particular presentation. Gerard explained what the housekeeping rules were as far as communication goes. That is also really important to be able to be a reminder for everybody to understand, muting microphones and turning off the video if you're not using it. It sets up all the expectations for the communication rules of this meeting. And I want to also really emphasize, having one person talking at a time. Because again, digital audio is not the same as 3D audio. So if you are in the same room and you've got two people talking at the same time, you've got one per taps coming into one channel and one person coming into the other channel. But in this kind of audio virtual environment, that's very different. Sometimes it's not really clear who's talking when, and it's much more challenging to process both of those conversations. And for the last point we have here, embracing the good meeting management techniques. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. Next slide, please. Oh, wait, George, did you want to add something before we go on?
Yeah, sure. And Tim, you can leave the slides. That's fine. So I just wanted to chime in with two quick things. The first, when we're talking about a singular point of contact for your meeting, I want to emphasize that person doesn't have to be an expert in all things and an expert in all accommodations or what have you. All they have to be is a communications conduit, right? I mean, I don't expect anyone to be an expert in the provision of sign language interpreting, but as a person whose job it is to coordinate sign language interpreters, it is helpful to have a single point of contact who's going to be able to answer questions about the meeting, understand who's going to be there, what's going to be talked about, and at least know all of the different things. So the only thing that I need you to do is be willing to learn, be willing to reach out, and be willing to write at the bottom of your emails, if you have questions about this meeting, please reach out to me. And I don't expect everyone to have all the answers, but what I usually tell people at the FCC is, if someone asks you for something and you don't know what they're asking for and you don't know how to do it, just give me a call, send me an email, and I will help you. But then you remain the primary point of contact for your meeting. And I'm just supporting you from the background to make sure you have the information you're looking for. Second quick point on the technology test that Brandon said that's so crucial, because the user interfaces, as we talked about earlier in some of the challenges, are so diverse, it is very difficult for people to conceive of what it is going to look like before we get there. As a frequent user of Zoom, I've got my understanding of what my Zoom setup looks like, but when we connected to our meeting this morning, there were a lot of differing expectations about what it was going to look like and whose video is going to be where and who's going to share the PowerPoint. There are a lot of logistics there that simply at this point in our development have to be worked out when we are there. So we have to do that technology test, particularly for some of these high profile or high impact meetings that you might want to have. Thanks, Brandon.
Thank you, Gerard, for your input there. If we could have the next slide. So meeting management techniques. So now we're going to go over some points about those specific techniques. So having an agenda and having that distributed as a detailed agenda prior to your meeting is important, so people can know and expect what is going to be discussed in the meeting. An attendee list, making a list available of confirmed attendees is also helpful. Doing a roll call at the beginning of the meeting helps, especially if people who are deaf are running the meeting, then they know who it is that's in there and they can remember who it is that's in the meeting instead of having to make assumptions about who's there or guessing. Because interpreters, if you have a rotation of interpreters and don't have dedicated interpreters, they may or may not recognize other people's voices in the meeting. And so having an attendee list and roll call is going to help to mitigate that. Having a moderator and assigning one person to serve as the meeting moderator is incredibly helpful. And that helps to just kind of like keep the meeting, rolling smoothly, asking people if they could mute their microphones or if somebody has their hand raised, being able to help to do the logistics of the meeting is oftentimes incredibly helpful. Naming announcements, reminding participants to identify themselves before they speak. This will help if there's CART or if there is a sign language interpreter, or if you have somebody who is blind, then they know who it is that's talking because they're not able to see on the screen. So this is oftentimes a really incredibly helpful tool. So right now, this is the interpreter speaking. There is a piece that is blocking the PowerPoint. There's a drop-down menu that's blocked. Thank you very much. Sorry about that. The next one is managed turn taking. So clear procedures need to be established, or utilizing a digital tool. That also needs to be established as far as managing turn taking so that there aren't people that are talking over one another, which makes it incredibly difficult to interpret. So the last one is document sharing. So if any of the relevant documents can be shared in advance, that gives people time to review them before the meeting. So before we change to the next slide, I want to emphasize again, if there's any documents or agendas or anything that is planned to be shared in advance, if you need to make sure that those documents are 508 compliant and accessible, regardless of the Word format or PDFs or what kind of format it ends up showing in the video itself. You can make captioning. You can also set that up ahead of time. You can print out Braille documents as well, so that people who are blind have access to the documents that are being shared. All of that stuff is incredibly important before the meeting. Gerard, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
Sure. Just real quick, there are some turn-taking tools that exist. Certainly, you've got hand-raising tools that exist in various platforms. We're going to go into that a little bit, that have their pros and cons. But there also are some other tools that are available online, free tools that are going to track who is in the queue to be called on, what have you. But then you've also got your single point of contact, and you've got the old school way of saying, this is Gerard. I just wanted to get in the queue because I have something to say. And then the meeting organizer or the meeting moderator is going to say, great, I've got you down, Gerard, but first we're going to go to Brandon. So Brandon and then Gerard, right? And then you're managing the turn taking. You're increasing the controls that people have with these demands. The demand is that they have to find some way to speak, but you're giving them a control, which is I can just raise my hand and get the turn. I think with that, we will move to the next slide. Okay. Sorry, I guess we're back one more. That's right. Brandon and I are both saying this at the same time.
So
Perfect.
could you go back, Tim, for one quick second?
Yeah. Great. You're right there, Tim. Perfect. These are just 4 more of our meeting management techniques that I'm going to take the lead on this time. Communication style, you can tell that Brandon and I have been attempting to describe everything that's on our PowerPoint here. Doing our best to speak at a moderate rate within our time constraints as well. And we're also following the agenda that we set out so that everyone can be oriented to what's going on in the meeting and be as inclusive as possible. Check-in. We did this at the top of our meeting where we reviewed our communication rules and then did a communications check-in. I highly recommend it. It usually takes 0 time just to say, does everyone have what they need for this meeting? Is everybody good? That's all it really takes. And people, I think, really take that to heart. And people who are having a problem have an opportunity to bring it to the fore. Soliciting feedback. Provide a contact for and specifically solicit feedback about the accessibility of the meetings. We talked about a POC prior to the meeting, but I would also encourage you to actively ask for any feedback and take that feedback so that what doesn't go well this time can go better next time, and trying to make sure that you've got that information collated and organized. And the last point here is screen share sparingly. That is a tongue twister, but I will tell you, screen and content sharing is not accessible to screen reader users. And it also takes screen space away from video and other bandwidth that might be needed. We were talking earlier about limited screen space and limited resources here. So we encourage you to use screen share and content share with caution. Consider toggling it on and off only when you need it. These screen shared content from a technical perspective, and I'm not a technical person. I mean, I'm a pro user, but I'm not a technical person like Brandon is. But we talked about this before. It was like, it's our understanding that generally any of these screener content sharing platforms are not screen reader accessible, right? To put a really fine point on it. And that is both of our understanding. Now, if you happen to know that there's one that is, our email addresses are at the end. I'm sure we'd both love to hear about it. But until then, let's just do that with caution. Brandon, anything else you wanted to add?
No, you covered it well. And I think, Gerard, you're on the next slide too.
This is Gerard. Yes, some equipment and tech recommendations. 3 main points on this slide. The first is to fine-tune your audio. You can't see me right now, is my understanding, but I am using a headset. This is a full headset. It looks like I am about to take off in an aircraft, but I can tell you what, I don't hear my kids playing down the stairs. I can hear everyone very clearly, and the microphone isolates sound just to my voice. It also helps me to avoid having echo cancellation. So splitting your audio input and output, which is something that you can often do in a lot of these platforms. You can set the microphone to be, let's say, your computer's built-in microphone, but you want to use headphones. What that is going to do is allow you to speak and still be heard. Otherwise, if you are using speakerphone, anyone who's hearing is probably familiar with the old speakerphone problem of when I start talking, I stop hearing who's there because your speakerphone is trying not to get into a feedback loop of creating echo. We also want to emphasize you should only use one audio connection method. A lot of these systems allow you to either call in or connect over IP audio. Just do the one. You don't need both. Now, if you have an accommodation reason or some other reason you need access to both, go for it. But most often what we see is people don't realize that one or the other is on. You can have a lot of feedback that starts to be created there. I'd encourage you to fine tune your video as well. Try to frame your shot. I always tell people to consider like from your belt buckle to just over the top of your head, as opposed to just staring at your forehead, which we sometimes see that person who's got a very, very high angle on their video. It can be difficult for sign language interpreters. It can be difficult for people who are deaf or hard of hearing who want to get access. You may want to consider getting an external webcam so you get a little more flexibility with where your screen is relative to your camera. So if you want to sit closer to your screen so you can see it, but that's putting you too close to your camera, getting an external camera that you can move further away is going to help you with that problem. You also may want to look at, if you do get an external camera, disable autofocus. Sometimes your camera will go in and out of being blurry because your camera is trying to get smart with you about where you are and autofocusing. Brandon and I have had that several times when we were playing with our presentation, putting together our PowerPoint. I was like, Brandon, could you turn off autofocus? Because it's like we're getting some static here. And consider turning off your video if it's not really needed. Usually at the FCC, we tell people if you're speaking, whether you're hearing or deaf, what have you, it makes sense for you to bring up your video. But I don't know that we really need to sit and stare at everyone else staring at their computers the whole time. We're all getting a little Zoom or WebEx fatigued. Why don't we turn off video unless we are actively speaking and then turn it on? And the last point on this slide, provide multiple connection options. So maintaining flexibility, we talked about customization earlier, for your attendees by allowing for as many different ways to connect as possible. So you can connect through your computer audio. You can connect through phone audio potentially. You could connect over audio only. You could connect over video only. That's going to allow people with disabilities to potentially deploy their own assistive technology that they may have. So a person who's hard of hearing may have an IP captioned telephone and they can make a telephone call and get access through captioning, but they're not going to be able to use that if they have to connect over IP audio. They're going to need to call in through your traditional 10-digit number. So try to keep those options available. Brandon, anything you wanted to add?
I do not. Thank you. Next slide, please. So this is Brandon. So I wanted to talk a little bit about technology and, I wanted to talk about captioning. So there are different kinds of captioning that are available. Once upon a time, there was no external captioning that was going on. And if we could just go to the next slide for just a second, because I want to skip this particular one and we're going to do this a little bit more because this is a little bit more complicated. So for time management purposes, I want to go on to the next slide, please. So as you can see, this poem that is on the left-hand side that says, "Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there was a tapping, as someone gently rapping my chamber door. To some visitor I muttered, tapping at my chamber door, only this and nothing more." So now if you look at the Microsoft that's above and the Google that's below, if you notice that the Microsoft, each line takes a moment, and the AI is trying to figure out things, and it works all right, but the words are not always, put correctly. I mean, chamber door showed up my chamber, or just some visitor. So the Google seems to be running on, a lot more accuracy. The words are not nearly as many in error. And so, that's not terribly surprising because Google has been playing with artificial intelligence for a while now. But there's still a lot left to be desired from the Microsoft version. Next slide, please.
All right.
Gerard?
This is Gerard. This is what you all came for. We're going to talk about Zoom. We've got pros and cons here. I'm going to quickly go through what's on the screen. Pros, highly accessible via screen reader. Blind users consistently say that Zoom is one of the most accessible for screen reader users. And not the least of the reasons behind that is because, B, it has this simple, intuitive user interface. It's very clean. It's very clear how you can get anything done. It also has what's called side-by-side mode or dual monitor support. So if you're doing a screen or content sharing and you have two monitors, you can get your content on one screen, your video on the other screen. If you've got one monitor, you can kind of cut it in half and you've got video on one side and screen share on another, and it gives you a lot of customization of that. Generally high quality video and audio, low stutter rates. If you are not connecting over video, you're calling in over your phone, or you've turned off your video, you can be hidden so you're not taking up screen space from other people who will otherwise need it. It's got built-in support for captioning in a meeting via either a participant just kind of typing captions in for the meeting, or via back-end API. There is a ability for your captioning vendor to push captions to Zoom. And it supports up to 100 simultaneous video participants, or 350 participants total for kind of your general license. Cons here, the integrated meeting management tools, like what we were talking about earlier, lack some sophistication. Hand-raising tool, like you can raise your hand, but it's very difficult. The chat is a little bit kludgy. The captioning display lacks customization, can't really be changed a lot. It's not very sophisticated. It's not very consistent. And the actual rate at which the captions jump in can be all over the place, and Brandon's got a lot more to say about that we'll get into real quick. There are security concerns. Everybody's heard about it. Every government agency and everyone everywhere has heard about it. And those are real, and your agency or your entity is going to have to consider the implications there. And there's also no built-in automated speech recognition. If you record a meeting, you can run it through automated speech recognition, but you can't live engage automated speech recognition. And I think with that, we'll move to the next slide. What we have here is just a screenshot of a Zoom meeting showing the gallery views, one of my staff meetings. And on the upper left, I'm wearing the Spider-Man costume. You're doing sports. It was your favorite sports team day, and my favorite sports team is Spider-Man. We'll go one more slide, and we'll show the side-by-side view. So we've got screen share on the left-hand side of the screen. You got a white line, and then you've got the gallery view of video on the right-hand side of the screen. And we'll jump to the next slide, and then Brandon's going to tell us a little bit more about captions.
This is Brandon. So this is the slide that shows what captioning would look like on Zoom. And maybe you're asking, why is it that this is Gwen? So let me explain for just a second. Zoom has an app for caption, which means that it allows captioning to be sent via software to the Zoom. For example, like it would showing here. The challenge with this design, however, is that the Zoom system is designed so when the Zoom had designed this, it was so every time that the Zoom receives a chunk of information or a chunk of data, it's considered a new line. And so keep that in mind, that there are different solutions to fix this issue. And you can either, lean heavily on Zoom or lean on, a CART software for that. With the Zoom solution, you can change their API to add an administrator of captioning. So before the captioning line, it won't disappear when you have a new set of data that's coming in. So if that's not working effectively on Zoom, then you can use CART software and that is got modified code in it that allows the software to keep the previous lines as new data is coming through. So that leads me to show you what the next slide has. If we could move to the next slide. So there we go. So this side has my own app that uses Google Cloud speech recognition. And there's not a lot of cart companies or that use this or know how to use this. And so this, is something that you need to have a deep understanding of technology for. So streaming text or any other kind of standalone captioning display is a solution for captioning. If Zoom or the captioning community decides to do some kind of like integration, this is kind of what the best solution has been thus far. Next slide, please.
And this is Gerard. I'm going to talk now about Cisco WebEx. We've got the same setup for this slide. We got some pros and cons. Pros: WebEx, easy to procure, secure, enterprise ready. It's been around a long time. It's a very mature product. You can also add a separate module for captioning. That's called the Multimedia Viewer. So that gives a little more flexibility to the captioning display in Cisco WebEx as compared to the kind of closed captioning style that you see on Zoom. And it's got centralized feature management. So you've got a lot of sophistication in how you're able to manage your WebEx account. You've got administrators who can turn on and off certain features for a given meeting. Cons: not really usable for screen reader users. We can't say that it's not accessible. I mean, there's a difference between usability and accessibility, but the WebEx interface is complicated. And when you have a complicated interface, just imagine looking at it through the end of a drinking straw, and that's what your screen reader experience is. The complex user interface requires some training to navigate, even for sighted users, for regular users. You need a lot of training to really feel comfortable using WebEx. The video pinning functionality for keeping one video up, like for an interpreter, is unintuitive. It's based on the frame location rather than the person. So if you're pinning somebody that's there, where you're pinning them to stay there forever, not trying to pin them to the main location, it's sort of difficult to explain and difficult to use. The video interface is also sort of inflexible. You don't have any ability to hide participants who aren't using video, so you get a lot of those white screens. They're displaying initials. Again, not ideal for users who are trying to access video. And one of the cons, I also listed centralized feature management. As a user, when you've got that kind of tiered access, that means that you got to engage a lot with administrators to make sure the right features are on for your meeting. And because there's so many options, it's such a mature product, it can be very overwhelming to kind of pick from all of these and to make sure you've got all of it set up in advance. And we'll hop to the next slide. And the next slide is just displaying the gallery view for Cisco WebEx. Again, it's pretty standard. You're not going to see a lot of difference across these interfaces. Can we go to the next slide, Tim? And again, here we've got a WebEx meeting center. We're displaying the multimedia viewer in the lower right-hand corner with some text in white over the black background, just showing some of the various aspects of Cisco WebEx. And Brandon, did you want to say more about the captioning viewer?
Oh, no, I'm good. Thank you.
All right. Then we can go to the next one. I think Brandon's going to tell us about Google Meet.
All right, this is Brandon. So this is Google Meet. So some of the pros are FedRAMP is approved for some agencies. It is easy to use and is intuitive. We have automated captioning and has a high accuracy in names of speakers, which is isolated audio channels. It also has recently added grid layout for video. There are screen reader and keyboard accessible. There is audio via phone connection, and there is a browser. It's browser-based, so there's no download required. Some of the cons are it's not widely available for government agencies, unfortunately, and it supports up to 25 video participants. That's it. Next slide, please. This is a screenshot of what it would look like on your computer and also on your mobile. So there's captioning that's on one of these, which you can see there. Next slide, please. Now we're going to talk about Adobe Connect for a minute. Here's some of the pros. It's a majority of the federal agencies are using it. It is easy to procure, security, and enterprise ready. There is a grid layout for video feed. There is a maximum user interface flexibility, which can be added as a dedicated pod for captioning, which is also nice. They have an HTML client and desktop application available. Now, some of the cons are bandwidth is intensive and it deprioritizes the video. There's a complex user interface. It is not usable for screen readers. There is no pitting of video. That functionality is non-existent, and it requires additional licenses for add-ons such as conference lines. I also wanted to mention that Adobe Connect is nice in the way that it is laid out. You can set your own preferences for people. Some people, it seems like it's a lot because there's a lot of different people that will show up on the screen in videos. And sometimes it feels like it's a lot of visual noise, but you, as your user, can set that up. Next slide, please, Tim. This is a screenshot of what an Adobe Connect page looks like. And there's all the different pods that you have available here. Next slide, please. This is a grid layout for Adobe Connect. Next slide, please. So I just added the captioning pod under my video, and you can see them side by side, which makes it pretty easy visually for a deaf member who's participating to see both the interpreter and the captioning at the same time. Next slide, please. Gerard, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, just quickly on the note of captioning. What we saw in the Adobe Connect video or screenshot is very nice because what you're seeing is what looks like kind of a traditional sort of stream text pod. So you're able to, as a user who's relying on the captioning, you can look up and down there as opposed to looking at like closed captioning where you're going to see something on the screen and then it's gone. You're able to review what has been said kind of in context. And that's a really important thing. We're going to talk about that more a little bit later, but sorry, Brandon, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that addition. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about Microsoft Teams for a minute. This is a very popular app that everybody is familiar with. Some of the pros on this is it's easy to procure. It is security and enterprise ready. Available at almost all government agencies with Office 365. It is built in across Office 365 applications for real-time collaboration, and it is embedded invite for one-click meetings via Outlook. Some of the cons are an all-in-one platform with numerous features that may confuse users. Trying to figure out how to do what where. It supports up to 9 video participants only. There are accessibility issues as far as guests unable to pin, unreliable captioning, screen reader access. It is not user-friendly and it is not intuitive. The captioning only is feasible using Azure AI. There's no other way to feed captions from CART or a CART provider. There is a license dilemma in obtaining alternative methods for accommodations. So, for example, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the licensing for G1, G3, and a G5. A G1 is a low-level tier for licensing. A G5 is the high-level tier for licensing. And Gerard had mentioned before about a higher tier, and the higher tier licensing, you get more features. And in that case, what we're finding out is in my agency, many of the people, almost all the people who have licenses are G1s or G3s, but not G5s. So what that means is that the tier ones don't have a dial-in through conference numbers for that specific team meeting. If you have a G5 license, then you have that ability. And so what that looks like is at DHS, my license is a G5. Well, the rest of my team are G1s or G3s. And so what we're finding out is that we're having other issues that are showing up with the higher licenses or the different tiered licenses. because all of the team meetings have to be hosted on my license in order for my features to be accessible for everybody, versus somebody who's on a G1 or a G3 hosting those meetings. So that's a lot of responsibility for me. So having that put out there is something that you should be looking at closely if this is an option that you are going to use as far as accessibility goes for your meetings, that there are some issues with the licensing that we didn't find out about until later. Gerard, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
Nope, I'm good. Thank you.
All right, next slide, please. So this is a screenshot of what Teams looks like. And you can see that it's a little bit more complicated behind there. There's many different features that feel like a lot. Next slide. So in the government cloud, in the GCC, there's captioning, but it's only available for a live event in Teams, but not for a regular meeting. So that changed, I think, maybe June 30th. It was just a couple of weeks ago, and they finally added live captioning for a team meeting, which is, a big milestone for many of us, the federal agencies who use Teams. We rely on Teams more and more and more, and as the live captioning was doing a beta test. So there was some of the video that you saw captioning, and it worked for a few seconds, but then it would freeze and disappear. And so then, while the people were still talking, the captioning was not accessible. And so they were aware of that issue and confirmed that they were still working on it and that they're in process of that. So it's being worked on. Next slide, please. I'm going to turn this one over to Gerard.
Sure. So the last thing that we're talking about in terms of platforms is live streaming. And we're not going to get in specifically to whether you use YouTube or Facebook or Twitter or Periscope or whatever you're going to be doing. But instead, we're going to talk more generally. Pros of streaming your meeting is you're using less bandwidth. You're just putting out one video. You're not maintaining multiple video feeds. You also have more control over what you are displaying, right? So you're able to curate that experience so that you're creating something that's maximum accessible and then broadcast that out to the world. You can use picture-in-picture for ASL interpreting. You can burn on captioning. You get more control over what that final product is going to look like. And you've got more ease of access. People are going to be able to watch it on their phone. They're going to watch it on their computer in their browser. It's a lot easier and less confusing to try to just watch a stream. However, the cons, to stream something requires a lot of moving parts, right? You need a technical know-how. Need to have specific solutions for that. And to make sure that that's accessible requires a whole other level of effort. If you're burning in the captions, meaning they're embedded in the video, those aren't accessible to screen reader users or people who are using refreshable Braille displays. So you got to be aware that while you're making something accessible for one group, you may be excluding another group. And streaming services sometimes kind of automatically add in. They're like, hey, well, we can plug in automatic speech recognition. Like, why not? For free. Like, because somebody just push a button, but you lose control over what that captioning looks like then. And so that reliance on ASR can sometimes create some embarrassing flubs and some errors in the captioning that perhaps your live captioning the meeting did not have. And when you're streaming, you've removed the user customization, right? You get more control, but somebody has to lose control, and it's the end user who loses control, and they're just going to get what you're presenting to them. We have a couple examples of streamed meetings that we're going to go through right now, and I'm going to ask Brandon if it's okay if I do a couple of these too. Okay, great. We go to the next one, Tim, and we're coming right up on our time here. What we've got now is a quick screen recording of a press conference. You've got a large governor on the left-hand screen. You've got a PowerPoint presentation in the middle, and the interpreter is this weird teeny size all the way over on the right-hand side. You've got all the pieces there. You've got captioning that's being displayed as well, but this is far from ideal. It's visually distracting. It would be hard to understand an interpreter that size as well. We go to the next slide. And now we've got a picture-in-picture of an interpreter. Again, press conference. The picture-in-picture is up on the right-hand corner of the screen. We've got captioning, traditional closed captioning coming over the middle. This is a fairly decent one, although, again, the interpreter is a little bit small here. It could be challenging to understand the interpreter there. We go to the next slide, please. Now what we've got is, again, we've got 3 panels on the left. We've got the presenter in the middle. You've got your PowerPoint slide, and on the right, you've got the interpreter. But here they are all the same height. They're fitting inside the same type of frame. So it's indicating kind of the relative importance here. You've got some more control over it. The captioning is not overlaying any of that content. The captioning is over a bar on the bottom of the screen. So it's not obscuring any of that content. It's a decent example as well. And if we go to the next slide, now we've got, again, a picture-in-picture. We've got a much larger picture-in-picture on the upper left-hand side, but then we have a transition to away from just a main speaker with an interpreter and a transition into a presentation. What they've done here, which is very nice, is they moved the governor into the lower left-hand corner. So you have the interpreter and the governor are the same size, both sharing the left-hand side of the screen, and then the PowerPoint is much larger there. So it shows the relative importance of those things as well. Brandon, did you want to add more to the analysis of those?
No, you've described it so well.
Okay, well, the next slide, as we get to our last 2 slides. So how do you pick a platform? I have bad news. None of these virtual meeting platforms are perfect. I've also written on this PowerPoint, sorry. Because if you came here looking for us to tell you all you have to do is procure this one solution and you're going to be good, it's got everything, Brandon and I don't know the answer. If you know someone who knows the answer, if you know the answer, I would love to know the answer. But in the meantime, what we have tried to provide you with are tools that you can use with any of these platforms, whatever is going to be accessible to you, so that you can provide the best user experience you can. First, you should check with your agency or organization. What do you have access to now? Lots of agencies and organizations already have procured something, so can you work with that? Then you want to engage people with disabilities to test and evaluate those platforms so that you can find those gaps, so that you can find those holes for your users. Then go back and look at our meeting management strategies, because there's a lot of stuff that you can do. Now, it's not the software doing it for you, but there's a lot of stuff that you could do to mitigate a lot of those weaknesses in your platform to improve the experience for your users. And you can also pull in other services to try to accommodate any of those weaknesses in your platform. The captioning display isn't great here. Cool. What we're going to do is we are going to push captions to a separate website. And somebody's going to screen share that website if that works for you. Or we're going to find a way to push it through as a video feed on our camera. Or individual users can pull it up on a second device of their choice, whether it be their smartphone or their tablet or what have you. If that's going to work for your users, so much the better. You want to use a hand-raising tool, something that's going to help you keep track of who's in the list. I have a feeling Brandon could program something like that in probably 15 to 20 minutes. I couldn't do it. But there's probably people in your organizations who either can do that stuff or can find that stuff for you. And Brandon, did you want to add anything on that slide?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
All right, then we'll go to the last slide. Brandon, take it away.
All right, next slide, please. So as a wrap up, asking the community how I can help. Tim, would you mind going back one slide, please? There you go. All right, thank you, Tim. So again, asking how I can help. It doesn't have to be perfect, but the enemy of the good. So don't stop collecting feedback and, making progress forward, staying flexible, and working to accommodate those who have disabilities, saving time and spending time to save time. So if there are, any questions or any ideas that you have, please feel free to reach out and contact either Gerard or I. Our contact information is here on the bottom of the page. It's gerard.williams@fcc.gov, and mine is brandon.pace@hq.dhs.gov.
And this is Gerard. Before I turn it over to Tim, thank you, Brandon. I wanted to quickly say on spend time to save time. Tim and everyone, we've spent a little bit more than our time here today, but hopefully it's going to save some time by spending our extra 5 or so minutes. We've answered some questions that would have otherwise been asked. But I encourage you all to really do that, to try to do the work in advance of and during your meeting to make your meetings more productive. Making your meetings more productive and denser, you're going to get more done. I know that it's tempting to kind of just go with the flow and try to do things the way that you've always done, but if you take that time, if you implement those techniques, I guarantee you're going to see increased participation from everyone, not just people with disabilities, but everyone. That's the universal design advantage, right? When we made curb cuts a requirement, we started seeing people on bicycles and people in strollers use them. And when you implement meeting management techniques for the purposes of including people with disabilities and managing accommodations, you're going to see increased participation and benefit from everyone. So with that, thank you. Thank you, Brandon, for presenting this with me today. And I guess we will turn it over to Tim.
Thank you, Brandon. Thank you, Gerard. And now we will go to the questions from the audience.
Everyone, this is Brooke Aiken, and I will be asking Gerard and Brandon 2 questions, live questions today. If we were not able to answer your question in the Q&A portion of the webinar, please send us an email. Brandon, this question is for you. How do you implement closed captions within MS Teams meeting recorded videos? So when you can play them back, you can review the video with closed captions.
Hi, Brooke. Thank you. This is Brandon. So when you're recording a meeting in Microsoft Teams, it automatically stores to Microsoft Stream. And that's an internal video repository website, only internal to your organization. Similar to YouTube, if you want to do a comparison. And with that being said, Stream does auto-generate captions, videos on their own without any dependency on Teams to produce any captioning. So if you forget to turn on the captions in Teams during the meeting, you don't have to worry, because Stream already takes care of it after the meeting recording concludes. So keep in mind that the captions will take a while to auto-generate, and it does not appear on your video instantaneously right after the meeting. Furthermore, also keep in mind that auto-generated captions shouldn't be your ultimate solution. Government agencies still have an obligation to ensure that the captions are accurate in compliance with Section 508 if you plan on distributing the video to a wider audience within your organization.
Thank you, Brandon. Next question is for Gerard. Gerard, can you provide best practice guidance for meetings that switch between multiple interpreters? Can you provide instructions for users to pin interpreters so their video stays on the screen?
Sure, this is Gerard, and as an interpreter, it's a very pertinent question. Of course, the specific way that you pin someone in any of these meeting platforms is going to vary. As we highlighted, WebEx is very different from the way that Zoom works, which is different from the way that Microsoft Teams works. So first and foremost, you want to identify that pinning capability. Second, you want to think about the type of meeting you're having. If you are leaving it to your attendees, as in a Zoom meeting that is not webinar based, you're leaving it to your attendees to customize their own display, you want to make sure that they have instructions for pinning the interpreter on their screen, which will leave everyone else's screens alone. However, then you of course have the time when we're going to have to switch from like our interpreter Joel, who's working right now, thank you Joel, to our other illustrious interpreter Mark, thank you Mark. And when they are trying to switch, they would then have to indicate to participants that they are going to switch to the other interpreter so that folks on their end can re-pin to the second interpreter who's working. There's a fairly standard way to do that by using the sign for giving the turn away, which I'm sure Joel is doing right now. Thank you, Joel. So you can indicate that fairly simply. And as long as, again, you're setting all of those things up in advance so that people know what to expect, hopefully you're going to be able to do that. As they have done during this presentation, however, if you're in webinar mode or what have you, you may have the meeting organizer or the moderator spotlight, which is called in Zoom, or freeze video on one person or another. And in that case, that person would have to be knowledgeable in communication with the interpreters about when they're going to switch so that they can push that button to switch from one interpreter to the other, or allow the interpreters the administrative privileges to do that themselves. In that case, they wouldn't have to tell you they were switching, because on your screen, one video would just be replaced with another. And I hope that answered that question.
Yes, it did. Thank you so much. We're on slide 42. Next slide, please. Is this the last slide? All right, thank you so much for participating in today's webinar. It was brought to you today by the United States Access Board and the CIO Council. Our next session is September 29th, 2020, Managing for Accessibility Throughout the Acquisition Lifecycle. Thank you all for attending. Thank you all to the presenters, and have a fantastic day.
With that, this concludes today's webinar. You may disconnect.